we got a flyweight scrap, as we have Tim Elliott coming in at plus 290, going up against Steve Erceg, who comes in at minus 355. Now, start off on the Tim Elliott side of things, who is coming off of a big upset win over Kai Asakura. But if you know, you know, right? We were able to cash a big underdog ticket there on Tim Elliott because we knew Asakura struggles with wrestlers. And Tim Elliott is probably one of the best wrestlers in the UFC's flyweight division, as he holds a ton of records. I believe he holds the record for most takedowns, most top control, a ton of records. I laid it all out in the Kai Asakura background, and it worked out perfectly there. In the striking realm, he's very slimy. He's very tough to deal with. He's very unorthodox with that approach in terms of how he throws his offense. Obviously, Asakura was really touching him up on the feet, but I was glad that Elliott eventually got to his grappling in the second round and pulled off the submission the way that he did. He's obviously getting up there in age. He's 39 years old. Obviously, something to take into consideration when you're capping his fights. But given the right stylistic clash, he can still go out there and pull off big wins like he did against Sumodarji and even Kai Asakura. If you even go back to his fight against Muhammad Makhachev, that was a fight where he was very close to pulling off the upset until he got caught in that submission in the third round. I believe he was up on the scorecards going into that third round, but unfortunately got caught by Makhachev, who has been able to pull out a lot of, wins from the fire in some of his UFC fights. And that Tim Elliott one was definitely one of them. So Elliott is often one of these guys that's often overlooked. That's why he was the underdog in the Asakura fight. That's why a lot of people overlooked him even in the Ulanbekov fight. I believe he was the first loss on Ulanbekov's UFC run as well. And I think that opened a lot of eyes to what Tim Elliott is capable of. When he's on, he's a very tough grappler to deal with. Very good chain wrestling, good scrambling ability, sneaky submission game as well. And it's just that unorthodox striking game that helps set that up for him. Now, this weekend, he's going up against Steve Erceg, who is coming off of a very close win over Ode Osborne. That allowed him to avoid a 4-fight losing streak that he had. He had a pretty early title fight that he was given against Alexandre Pantoja. I believe that was UFC 301. And that was a fight that he was very close to winning, right? I thought it was 2-2 going into the final round. And I thought if he had stayed away from the grappling, which he had successfully done earlier in that fight in some of those rounds, he would have been able to go out there, outstrike Pantoja, and probably win that fight on the scorecards. Unfortunately, for some reason, he decided to go to the grappling, maybe felt he could get ahead of Pantoja there and probably find a submission as Pantoja was starting to slow down. But as we come to know Pantoja, even with how bad his gas tank looks at times and even how bad his body language looks, once fights get into the grappling realm, he just turns this gear on that he's able to get ahead in scrambles and to stay ahead of his opponents in most of those spots. And that's how he was able to get the better of Erceg in the last round there. Then Erceg tries to bounce back against Kai Kara-France, gets absolutely dead with the knockout power that Kara-France brings. Then the Brandon Moreno fight. I believe Erceg took that fight on short notice. Tough spot for him going into Mexico City, and he just didn't stay busy enough. Moreno was just doing more, throwing more output, staying more active, and that was enough for him to clearly win that fight over Erceg. Then the short notice spot came against Ode Osborne, right? I forgot who Erceg was supposed to fight initially, but Osborne stepped in on short notice, hurt Erceg very badly in the first round, but then Erceg was able to survive the next 2 rounds, get off on better damage of his own, and able to pull off the win. Now, that fight, even though he came out on top, has changed the public sentiment on Erceg tenfold. People think he's a fraud now. People think he's just not that good. People think that, he wasn't deserving of the Pantoja title shot when he got it. But I really think it's just the tough strength of schedule he's been going up against. And we've seen fighters, have those slip-ups against fighters that they should go out there and absolutely squash, right? I'm not saying that Steve Erceg is Elliott Topuria level, but you guys remember when Topuria was nearly finished by Jai Herbert? That might be Erceg's moment, right? I know obviously he has more losses than Topuria at this point in time, but I think you got to give grace to some of these fighters for having some minor slip-ups at times. You got to credit him for being able to come back from nearly getting finished in the first round and having strong second and third rounds the way that he did. He's a very good Muay Thai specialist. He's a BJJ black belt. I think he is one of the more skilled fighters in the flyweight division. It's just going out there and following a proper game plan and actually, not getting clipped by a big shot by Kai Kara-France, not getting clipped by Ode Osborne, staying busier against Brandon Moreno. So I think sentiment, even though he's minus 355 right now, sentiment is pretty low on Steve Erceg. Now, speaking of minus 355, Erceg, I believe, was minus 450 when I originally broke down this fight in written form late last week. So there's clearly been love coming in on Tim Elliott, and I agree. I believe this fight should be closer than that. I think Elliott deserves a little bit more respect. I'd put him closer maybe to maybe plus 150. So if you're seeking value on Elliott, I believe it's fully there. But this is one of those fights where I feel like people might go for the value on Elliott, but Erceg will still come out on top. I think Erceg is the more effective striker, and I think that will be pretty clear as we start working through this fight. And then once it gets to the grappling realm, I think Erceg has good enough defensive grappling to ward off Elliott's attacks there. I think Erceg's BJJ will allow him to stay away and out of bad positions from Elliott for too long. I don't think Elliott has the type of control that Pantoja has to keep Erceg in these bad spots. And it also wouldn't surprise me if Erceg is able to catch Tim Elliott in a submission the way that Mokaev did, the way that Brandon Royval did. I think Erceg has that level of jiu-jitsu that he could catch Elliott in one of these weird scrambles. So I'm going to pick Erceg. I'll keep my eye on the line throughout this week, but I feel like Erceg will end up landing more damage. I think he could potentially get a submission of his own as well, but I think he's going to be able to nullify the grappling of Elliott, pick him apart on the feet, and then win this fight on the scorecards. So I'll go Erceg by decision, but I'll wait and see where this line goes on fight week to see if I actually end up pulling the trigger on him.